Alright guys, in today's episode we are going to be talking about torque converters. If you guys haven't been following this build, this is my 1981 Ford Fairmont station wagon that we have swapped a Vortec 4200 into, with a big old turbo on the side of course, and we have been slowly developing this car over the years. Recently you saw that we got into the 8s with this car, and we did that after we had just made a change to the torque converter. So today I kind of want to talk about everything you need to know about torque converters. Alright guys, I think the best way to show you how a torque converter works is to actually cut one apart and show you the parts inside. In the name of science, this torque converter right here is going to give its life to us today. This is a stock 4L80E converter. I believe this was behind a Duramax, so this is a very large core. This is designed for maximum coupling. The stall speed is going to be very low, so I don't really feel guilty about cutting this thing up because we'll probably never use it. And even if I was to sell the thing, it probably would only bring like 20 to 40 bucks. So this converter will have a lockup clutch inside of it. So let's get it torn apart. Okay, that was a pain in the butt. All right, guys, that took a little bit of effort to get apart, but I finally got it, so let's take a look at what's inside. So this right here, this is what is called the pump. Now, this is tied to the outer case of the transmission and spins at crankshaft RPM. You can see here, there's this little drive flange here. This is actually engaged into the hydraulic pump inside of the transmission. So this will constantly be spinning while the engine is running and creating hydraulic pressure. Now inside of here there are a bunch of blades, and the fluid gets drawn in through the outside and pushed down through the center. This is sort of the one fan blade that I was talking about. So there you have the pump. Next on the layered cake we have a Torrington bearing. Now that we have that bearing out of the way, we have the stator. So as you can see, this is a component and it has a bunch of blades in here, and they are at a particular angle. You can see they're sort of shaped like an airplane wing. They're sort of sharp on the one side and sort of curved on the other side. That's because the fluid is flowing down into this component right here. Also on the back side of the stator we have a piston right here, and this is actually the lockup clutch piston right here. This component will move back and forth and engage the lockup clutch, which we will get to later. The next component on the stack is another bearing. The next component is what is called the turbine. So this right here, this is what is connected to the input shaft of the transmission. You can see a smaller spline section down in the center there. So this takes the fluid movement from the engine and it harvests the energy here and spins this, and that's what actually drives the car. This is how it accomplishes the whole fluid coupling thing that I was talking about earlier. On the back side of the turbine, we have this other spline section here, and this engages with the torque converter clutch, which we will get to next. The next section on the pile is the torque converter clutch, and you'll actually see that it looks a lot like a manual transmission clutch. It has these springs here, which help to dampen the engagement of the clutch itself. And on the back side, you'll see that here, this friction material here on the outside, that is your actual clutch. And that's basically how this works. You can see the lockup clutch is very wide on this. This is actually a lot larger than I thought it would be. I know on a lot of the racing type torque converters, they'll actually use like direct clutches from like a Turbo 400, and they're only about this diameter here, this diameter right here. That's about how big they are. So the fact that it comes all the way out to the edge here means that it's going to hold a lot more torque. And it's actually kind of neat to see this component right here. Now that we have the torque converter blown apart, I can actually dry assemble this thing and kind of show you how the torque converter works without any metal in the way. So I grabbed a pump section out of a 4L80E right here, and we're going to put this thing together. Now, as I mentioned before, this is the pump section of the transmission, and this spins at engine RPM. And I also mentioned that this front snout here inserts into the pump of the transmission. So if we pull the pump apart, you can actually see the part that it will drive against. And that is this component right here. So this component right here, this is the actual pump. And you'll see these two little flats here. This is actually the section that the pump will drive against, and it'll spin this gear and create hydraulic pressure. So that is the pump. So let's go over the components here. This is the spline part that engages with the stator right here. This right here is your input shaft. So this thing will spin, and this is actually what gets driven to drive the all the gears and everything inside of the transmission. So let's put this thing together. So the first part that we will put on is that pump stage of the transmission. There we go. All right, so now we have the pump portion of the torque converter installed. So that drives our hydraulic pump in the transmission, obviously. Next component to go on is our stator. Now our stator goes on like so, and you can see that it engages with the splines here on the pump section of the transmission. And there's another component here that I forgot to mention as well. There's also a sprag inside of here. So when it's normally being driven, the stator will stay stationary, but I guess it will freewheel on deceleration. So the stator is actually not really a stator. It will actually move, but most of the time for what we're concerned about with it, it is stationary. So as you can see, the pump portion of the transmission will spin at engine RPM, and it will bring in fluid through the outside here, through these little blades, and then it will come up through the center, and the stator portion of the torque converter, this will sort of guide the fluid down to the turbine section of the torque converter. So next up, let's put on the turbine section. So the turbine section here actually engages into the input shaft here. So let's drop that down on, and we got ourselves a pizza pie. So the outer pump portion of the torque converter will pump fluid down through the stator, and then it will translate that into movement of the input shaft of the transmission. And that's basically how a torque converter works. One last component that isn't on all torque converters but is on this one is the torque converter clutch, and that sits down like so. And again, it uses this friction material to tie the input shaft right here to the outer portion of the torque converter. So when those two get tied together, the input shaft and the outside portion of the torque converter become one, and that creates the torque converter lockup. So this is kind of a simple device. There's a lot of black magic going on inside of here. Every component in this torque converter plays into how the torque converter harvests energy from the engine. The number of blades on the turbine, the number of blades on the pump, the angle of the blades on the stator, the number of blades on the stator, the diameter of the overall pump section and turbine section. These all play into how the torque converter will work. And this is why you only really see like specialized manufacturers who will take on torque converters. You really need to have a very large data set for the products that you offer, and that's why a lot of people turn to experts for this type of device. There's a lot of fluid dynamics involved in this, and I'm sure they have lots of like CFD type programs that will sort of project the flow through these things. In my opinion, the only way you're going to really figure out how this thing behaves is if you actually run it and see how it behaves with your particular engine combo. And it's very likely that you're going to be making changes to this to dial in the optimal combo, just like we're doing on my station wagon. All right, normally when you see a torque converter, you will see it listed by what is called stall speed. And stall speed can be kind of a can of worms. Stall speed refers to the maximum engine RPM that you can bring the engine up to before it starts to push through the foot brake. Now, stall speed is very much dependent on what size engine you have, how much stroke it has, how much torque it makes at a particular RPM, how good your brakes are. So when they list this stall speed, it's something that you kind of have to look at with sort of an asterisk, and your mileage may vary. In general, though, you can think of stall speed as how loose or how tight the torque converter is. When I say loose, that means it takes more engine RPM to get the car to move, and tight would be vice versa. Now, in general, with a torque converter, the smaller the torque converter, the higher it will stall. Now, in general, for a drag car like this one, you want something that's on the looser side, but not so loose that it is taking the power from the engine and just turning it into heat. And that kind of brings us to why we are making the change today. The torque converter that I was running in the car, it is a 232 millimeter core, meaning 232 millimeter diameter, and we are moving to a 245 millimeter. I tend to like a converter that is on the looser side, and that's kind of how we ended up here. I initially told Pete at Circle D that I wanted something that I could foot brake to, like 4,000 RPM. He was a little hesitant as to whether he could provide that or not, but it works pretty well. I'll just say that. Now, I kind of want to bring you in close here and show you the new torque converter. Now, the old torque converter is the one right here, and the new one is the one right here. Now, the old one is a standard style torque converter with a billet steel back face, pretty normal for a 4L80E. But the new one is a little bit more fancy. And I got to say, huge thanks to Pete at Circle D. This thing is pretty sweet, and I'm really excited that they worked with us on this, and I'm excited to see how this one performs. What makes this a little bit more special is it is what is called a bolt-together torque converter. And as you can see, there are these bolts around the perimeter, and you can take the whole torque converter apart. Now, what is advantageous about that is you can make tuning changes to the torque converter without having to send it back to the guys at Circle D. Alright guys, now we're going to look at some data logs and show you some concepts of the torque converter that are important to look at. So first off, you can see in yellow here, this is engine RPM. In cyan here, we have the input shaft RPM. And in red here, we have the output shaft RPM of the transmission. So the slip between the torque converter will be the difference between this yellow line and this cyan line. And this first portion of the log is me sitting on the trans brake and building some boost. You can see it goes up to my 2-step RPM and sits there until I let the button go. Now, the next thing that is important to look at in a data log is the flash RPM. Normally, as soon as you let off the trans brake, it immediately jumps up to a certain RPM and sort of holds there and then continues to rev. Now, on the converter setup that I had in the car, it never really did that. And the flash RPM is probably in the neighborhood of 7,200 RPM, so we'll call it right there. The next thing that you should be paying attention to is your RPM drop between the shifts. So when you do your 1-2 gear shift, you can see I went from 78.98 down to 74.76, so that's about a 500 RPM drop. In general, you should probably try to get a little bit more than that. This converter is definitely too loose for what we're doing, but you're going to see that we tighten it up later, and you'll see it had a pretty dramatic difference. Now, on a car with stock rods in particular, this particular thing right here, the RPM drop on the shift, is extremely important. You need to make sure that the torque converter doesn't drag the engine RPM down too low, because that's what will fold your rods. This, however, is not enough. We could definitely get a tighter torque converter, and it would translate into a better elapsed time for the car. It does not need to be this loose. The other concept we can look at here is the slip between the engine RPM and the input shaft RPM. You can see that down low there's a lot of slip, and as we rev the thing out, the slip only ever gets down to like a 1200 RPM slip, and when we go through the traps, it is right around 1500 RPM slip. Now, if we engage the lockup on this torque converter, this engine RPM and the input shaft RPM would come together, and it would they would match each other because, again, they're locked up. We didn't do that on this car. I only have a single disc lockup on this car, so we're not doing that on this car. Next, I'm going to bring up a data log of when we tightened the torque converter. It's a little bit hard to see here, but these dotted lines here are the comparison file. That was the run that I did with the tighter stator, and I believe he made some changes to the pump blade angles. The shift drops with the new torque converter are still right around 500 RPM, and going through the traps, it is right around a 900 RPM slip. So we're actually going to be looking at tightening up the torque converter even more, and hence that's why we have the new torque converter that you may have noticed earlier in the video. Now, I will admit this is one of my most hated jobs on a car. It involves squeezing your hands into difficult to reach places, dropping the wrench 1,500 times, rolling around on the ground, trying to get all of the bolts out, and usually getting covered in transmission fluid. I just hate this job. In the future, I want to build a car that makes it super easy to pull the transmission out, because it's pretty normal to be pulling the transmission on a high-end race car like this. But you just got to push through it and get it done, because if you don't do it, nobody's going to do it for you. Alright, now that you got your torque converter installed, here's a pro tip. Before you bolt the transmission back up in, it is always good to verify that the transmission is fully seated. A good way to do that is to put a straight edge on the bell housing face. As you can see, our spacing between the converter mounting flange and the bell housing face is 1 inch and a 1/16. So that means that the torque converter is fully seated, and we should be good to go. The problem that you can face here is if you don't have it fully seated and you try to put it up in and try to bolt the bell housing down, what you can do is you can either do very bad damage to the pump of the transmission, or you could actually crack the bell housing on the transmission if you're not careful. So this is very important, and it will help you to avoid any issues. Another critical dimension is once you have the transmission bolted up to the engine, you need to check what is called the converter spacing. So with the converter pushed all the way back into the transmission, you need to check the spacing here between the mounting pad and the torque converter. That spacing needs to be between 1/8 and 3/16 of an inch. Once you tighten these bolts, it will pull the torque converter forward. And the reason this spacing is so critical is if it's too loose, it will pull the torque converter so far forward that it will disengage from the pump and potentially do damage. And if it's too tight, then two possible things can happen. One, there is not enough space in between, in this section of the torque converter. There's not enough space for the fluid to flow into the torque converter. Or two, it can be so tight that it causes it to knock the thrust out of the engine because it's not able to expand or move around. I tend to go on the looser side of that spec, so I shoot for closer to 3/16 of an inch. So the easiest way to do this is with a drill bit. Basically, you'll get an 1/8 inch drill bit. You should be able to slip that into the gap very easily. And then you'll get a 3/16 drill bit, and it should not slip into the gap here. And if both of those are true, then you have enough gap there, and you should be good to go. I can already feel how much tighter this torque converter is. Just in the amount of effort it takes to pull out. It used to take a lot more RPM to get the car to move. Here, I'll show you. Yeah, that is totally different. This thing cruises good. All right, guys, here's the next question. Can I stall it up as high on the foot brake? So pushing the brake real hard, let's see what happens. That didn't sound good. I mean, the answer is yes, I can stall it up high, but I don't know what that squealing sound was. It's not my belt. That looks fine. My brakes. Huh. Well, I don't know if this would have caused the squealing problem, but my fuse here in my relay for my fan got super loose, so obviously this guy got pretty hot. So you remember the last time that you guys saw this car and I said, I probably needed new brakes? Well, this guy is locked up. That rear end is not moving. So I think I just need new brakes, and that's probably what the squealing sound was. Weird that it didn't show its ugly face until I pulled up the driveway. I had already told myself I wasn't gonna race it without getting new brakes. Now I'm not gonna drive it until I get new brakes. The last thing that we're going to talk about with a torque converter is a converter dump. So a converter dump is basically a electronic solenoid that will go in line with the fluid feed to your torque converter. And like I've said a couple times, this right here, this is a fluid coupling. It will not work if there is not fluid in there. So what guys will do when they have tons of horsepower, and it's usually a turbo car application, where the engine doesn't really make a lot of horsepower naturally aspirated, but once the boost comes on, it makes all kinds of power. What those guys will do is they will use this converter dump in order to starve the torque converter of fluid. As you can see, I can spin this thing around all I want, and nothing is going to happen unless there is fluid flowing through this thing. The side effect is it makes this pump very inefficient, and it creates a ton of heat. Now, if you do a good job of cooling the fluid off in between rounds and, you know, that sort of thing, it's not really that big of a deal. Obviously, you don't want to stay on the trans brake for too long, or else you're going to break down your fluid. And what a lot of guys will do is they will use high-end fluids, such as John Deere High Guard and some of the, you know, more racy stuff that I'm sure is a lot more expensive. And the benefit of fluids like that is they are more stable at higher temperatures, so they will maintain their properties and not cause air bubbles and that kind of stuff to start to form. And they are able to basically starve this thing of fluid until the engine is able to start generating some boost, and then they will put the fluid back into the torque converter and make it more efficient and get the thing to generate even more load and make more boost. And it's sort of a way to make it so that a 121 cubic inch engine with an 88 millimeter turbo can actually get this thing wicked up, but also this torque converter will be able to hold the amount of horsepower that that 122 cubic inch engine makes at 70 pounds of boost. With that, I think I'm going to end this video off here. Make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one. All right, have a good winter, Fairmont. We'll see you in the spring. Ugh.